Good afternoon. As you're aware, an important function of this meeting was to honor the doyens of Indian public finance. And maybe for yesterday, when that function was happened here, Professor Isaac could not join because of reasons beyond his control. So I think we are going to do that function now in 2 minutes' time. I invite Professor Govind Rao to come over.
Professor T.M. Thomas Isaac. The Gulati Institute of Finance and Taxation and the Madras School of Economics take immense pride in honoring Dr. T.M. Thomas Isaac, a distinguished economist, prolific bilingual author, and an influential policymaker. As a member of the Kerala State Legislative Assembly for 2 decades and as a member of the State Planning Board, he spearheaded the groundbreaking People's Planning Initiative, redefining participatory planning in Kerala. As Kerala's finance minister from 2006 to 2011 and 2016 to 2021, he left an everlasting mark on the state's fiscal and economic policies and pioneered the idea of mobilizing extra budgetary resources for infrastructure development and also transforming Kerala to a knowledge economy. Founding chairman of Gulati Institute of Finance and Taxation, he is currently an honorary fellow at Center for Development Studies and distinguished professor of Gulati Institute of Finance and Taxation. He is an acclaimed author of over 50 books in Malayalam and English and a winner of Kerala Sahitya Academy Award in 1989. His legacy exemplifies advocacy for Kerala's development with social justice. Distinguished academicians, esteemed professors, valued guests joining us both in person and online, dedicated students and research scholars, a very warm welcome to all of you. It is an honor to gather here today for the Professor I.S. Gulati Centenary Lecture, a tribute to a distinguished economist whose lasting contributions have profoundly shaped the discourse on public finance and development. This special lecture, titled Economic Uncertainties, a perspective on fiscal prudence, rules, and risks, brings together some of the finest minds in the field to deliberate on the evolving challenges of economic policy and fiscal governance. We're privileged to have with us esteemed chairs and eminent speakers, and we extend a heartfelt welcome to each one of them for joining us today. Guiding today's discussion, we have two distinguished chairs. First, we extend a warm welcome to Professor T.M. Thomas Isaac, former Finance Minister of Government of Kerala. With his vast expertise in fiscal policy and governance, Professor Isaac has played a key role in shaping Kerala's economic strategies. We're honored to have him chair this session. We also extend a heartfelt welcome to Dr. Hasib Drabu, former Finance Minister of Government of Jammu and Kashmir. An economist and policymaker of great repute, Dr. Drabu's expertise in financial governance and economic planning adds immense value to today's discussion. So we are delighted to have you with us to chair this session. It is now my privilege to welcome our distinguished speaker for the evening, Professor Pinaki Chakravarti, former director of the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy. A highly respected economist, Professor Chakravarti's work has significantly influenced fiscal policy and public finance in India. So it's an honor to have you here, and we look forward to your lecture. Before we proceed with the lecture, we'll take a moment to honor the legacy of Professor I.S. Gulati. It's only fitting that we begin with the commemoration of his contributions, and for that, we are privileged to welcome Dr. A.V. Jose, former director of Gulati Institute of Finance and Taxation, and an acclaimed academician who has contributed to theory and practice. So we're delighted to have you with us today. We have two chairs for this session. I request Professor T.M. Thomas Isaac to initiate the session and the other chair, Dr. Hasib Drabu, to facilitate the conclusion of the session. To take the discussion forward, I now invite our esteemed chairs, Professor T.M. Thomas Isaac and Dr. Hasib Drabu, to take over the proceedings of the session.
Prof. Chakravarti, Hasib Drabu, and dear Jose. It's indeed a great honor to chair this commemoration address by the finest of Professor Gulati's student, in fact mine also, in public finance. Along with Hasib Drabu, we have been together in CDS, and when I became the finance minister the first time, Hasib invited me to Kashmir, where I realized the chairman of J&K Bank was more important than the finance minister of J&K. So he planned this idea of having a bank. Took some time to come to fruition, but I think that was the beginning of Kerala Bank. And the next time, we were both ministers, and we had a lot of fun in the GST Council. Lots of fun. I don't want to go into that. There are a lot of fond remembrances about Professor Gulati. Luckily, was I a student of his, but later his colleague at Center for Development Studies and also colleague in the planning administration of Kerala. And for a brief stint, fellow activist for decentralization. Yes, there is a phase in Professor Gulati where he traveled to every district of Kerala to campaign for certain fundamental changes in the draft bills that were being, the conformity acts that were introduced in Kerala. And because of this background, when the new government was formed, EMS Namburipan invited Professor Gulati, me, and EM Sridharan and told one, this government's agenda is going to be democratic decentralization. A process which he had started in 1957. So a Sen committee was set up. But EMS wanted one thing. When finally the report comes, it may take 3 or 4 years, we must have something done in the state to create a political will, cutting across political divide. Everyone must come forward for implementation of decentralization. So we took to a strange path where social mobilization was the key element of decentralization through the instrument of local planning. So it was a very exciting time. The theme of today's talk, commemoration talk, is about the local finances, but public finance in the age of new risks, new risk and in the rule-based governance. In fact, there's a fundamental change that has taken place in the public finance, where now public finance is more rule-based. Its limitations come clear in times of uncertainty, where this rules doesn't apply, and you are forced to divest yourself of it. I hope today's talk will enlighten us on this aspect. The new rules, will they, how do they facilitate us to face these uncertainties and the risk? How does the new rules comply with our aspirations for development? I don't want to speak more, but I think there will be a session following up. I'll wait for that. So I think, Hasib, you should say something. And then, no. You don't have to speak. Now, it's not respond to him. Nobody will respond.
Not to respond. Thank you very much, Isaac. Always a pleasure meeting you. I was quite disturbed when I heard that you were not well, but wonderful to see you here. Thanks, Joseph, for inviting me. I'm not very good with dates, but I remember it was September 1983. T.N. Krishnan had invited, who was the director at that time of CDS, invited the new batch, the 1983-84 batch where Joseph and I were together, to his Kumarapuram residence for an evening out. And I had come in my Kashmiri attire, which was like a shalwar and a kurta. And I walked into this sea of veshtis, lungis, mundus, and I saw one radiant face coming at me with a certain purpose. And he looked at me and he was wearing something very similar, so I felt very comfortable. That was Professor Gulati, ISG, we used to call him. Geographically, he came from Bannu in Northwest, which is closer to where I come from. And I remember many years later, Mrinal Chaudhary was here, who was, I think, a professor at Delhi School of Economics. He was nursing a drink. There was a conference here in 1986, it was, Joseph, am I right? And he looked at ISG and said, strange are the ways of Lord. What is a tribal Pathan doing among coconut trees and sea beaches? But ISG made home for all this for 30 years. And I remember that time I was not really interested in federal finance, but I distinctly remember that he had collaborated with George, right? KK George. And they produced a book in Transfers in Fiscal Federal Finance, I think, which had the introduction written by Ashok Mitra. And I remember that time, and it still finds so fascinating how he had carved out this space for himself. In that book, they talked about institutional transfers beyond government transfers. Federal finance has been stuck with governmental transfers for the last 70 years. But here was a person in 1980, he was writing about institutional transfers being more critical than government transfers and had collated that data. And today, if we look back at it, perhaps government transfers are maybe a fraction of the private institutional transfers. And that is causing a lot of kind of regional inequalities you talked about by KP Kannan today and so on and so forth. So one of the abiding lessons would be I would genuinely think that, since it's a body of students here, that it would be wonderful to update that book, to bring it up to date of what's happening. And you will see a massive transition of how federal finance has worked and what would be required to evolve a new federal fiscal framework, which is what we're going to discuss in the next session. But it will be an enduring tribute to Professor Gulati and KK George, who worked on federal finance and laid out a certain pathway, which somewhere down the line we had forgotten. We spent a lot of wonderful times with ISG and at his house in Kumarapuram, and I have, as I said, very, very fond memories of how he would treat us and how he would deal with it, and how he would constantly be advising governments of all kinds with various issues, and also help set up something like the CDS, which has its own record and reputation. I was very, as Isaac mentioned, I mean, it was great for us we were perhaps two finance ministers from CDS at that point of time in the GST Council. And my official role in GST Council was to be Isaac's translator. I had no other role. So Isaac couldn't understand anything about in Hindi. So I would constantly keep translating him. But it was very nice and heartening to see when GST was launched. Arun Jaitley mentioned 3 finance ministers that they have made great contribution to GST. Out of the 3, 2 are here, both from CDS. Thank you very much.
Okay.
friends, on this occasion of celebrating the centenary of Gulati, Iqbal Singh Gulati, my role is to say a few words before you have the formal centenary lecture. Indeed, I.S. Gulati was a great teacher, an eminent scholar, and a passionate campaigner of public interest. He, as Hasib Drabu mentioned, he was born in Banno in the northwest frontier province in a Sardarji family of Pathan stock, which Iqbal Gulati was very proud of. Banno, I'm not sure if you would know, many of you would know, was a town on the edges of the great Silk Road, linking major civilizations of the world. And it was also sort of adjacent to the very ancient seat of learning called Takshashila. You have to see to believe that wonderful palimpsest of knowledge in that the way that city was organized. I had a rare privilege of doing that. But then the important thing about that city is that even being born in its precincts must have instilled into the genes of Iqbal Gulati that deep sense of proselytizing, spreading the work of scholarship and knowledge to the rest of India. And the tragedy of partition facilitated or made it possible earlier than scheduled. The kind of trauma that his family went through when they shifted residence to Delhi is narrated in a piece by his sister, Narula, Sushil Narula, which was transcribed by Leela Gulati in a wonderful volume, edited by Leela Gulati and Jasodhara Bakchi, a space of her own. Iqbal Gulati started working at a very early age. I think he told me when he was 19 years old as a junior civil servant in the Planning Commission. And his earnings could take care of his siblings and also the family whose fortunes had waned. And in the Planning Commission, that was the important turning point in his life. He ran into K.N. Raj, who facilitated his move to the LSE, London School of Economics, for a PhD. And that also set the stage for Gulati's travel out of the known precincts to the rest of India, again in search of the soul, heart and soul of India. It was the kind of a reverse migration of knowledge, I would say. He, having done his PhD, came back and started working with the very eminent financial specialist of that time who came to set the taxation system in India, right, Nicholas Calder. And thereon, he went to work in the Baroda University, MSU, where he took up a teaching career. And that's also the place he ran into the love of his life, Leela Gulati, this stunningly charming woman of that time. They got married. That also started his lifelong association with the Economic Weekly, the Economic and Political Weekly of latter years. Gulati's visit to Kerala, Thomas Isaac, I think he mentioned about it, was again instigated by K.N. Raj, who advised him to go to Trivandrum and help the EMS Namboodiripad ministry, which had come to power through the ballot box, by the way, in 1957. And he fell in love with this verdant town. And that was a love which lasted his lifetime. And back to the Baroda University, and thereon he went to work with the UN organizations and with the IMF in the Caribbeans. And in 1972, K.N. Raj invited him to join the founding fathers of the Center for Development Studies. That was an amazing crowd of people. Panikkar, Krishnan, Vaidyanathan, and Krishnaji. Gulati, of course. By that time, Professor Gulati had become a member of the Finance Commission too. Together, they initiated the launch of a very distinguished institution. Those halcyon days are described in a beautiful obituary written by Ashok Mitra after Gulati passed away, and also in a recently published volume, Memoirs of Krishnaji, which was released by his daughter very recently. We were the privileged beneficiaries of the kindness and concern and empathy of Gulati and his colleagues, who was the youngsters. Iqbal Gulati would spend any amount of time making sense of whatever you drafted and then turn it into beautiful prose. That was a talent he had. And one memorable piece of advice he gave me, and I remember very well, is be extremely cautious when you are dealing with written words. They, unlike spoken words, do not disappear in the air. You commit yourself to history one way or the other when you write something. Gentle, soft-spoken, picking his words very carefully. The farthest he would go by way of an admonition was to tell you with a gentle smile on his face, my dear, you are not talking like an economist. Thanks to the prescience of those wonderful human beings, we were trained to face tough times in our working lives and hopefully become even marginally better human beings at their behest. And Kerala state reciprocated I.S. Gulati's kindness and generosity. Twice he became the chief of the state's planning board. Ashok Mitra wrote that would not have happened in any other state. As an activist, Gulati campaigned vigorously for greater autonomy of the local self-government institutions, which is part of the folklore, which led to major constitutional reforms in India. His death came in 2002 after a protracted illness, which he faced silently with grace, fortitude, and a great deal of dignity, even as he strived for the state and for the students in this state. In 2009, when Thomas Isaac, his student and colleague, became the finance minister of Kerala, this institution was built as a monument to the memory of Iqbal Gulati. And that was a unique tribute paid to another distinguished son of Kerala. I happened to be around at that time to facilitate the construction of this edifice, including this beautiful auditorium you are seated. And looking back, how would we and posterity judge Professor Gulati and his generation of scholars? To us, he has always been a beacon of light, the flag bearer of the idea of India, modern India, secular and democratic, and always dedicated to preserving equity and decency and fairness in our lives. We honor his memory forever when we dedicate ourselves, when we dedicate ourselves to the values he stood by. Thank you for listening. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm really uh, humbled by this invitation. It's a big responsibility given to me by Professor K.J. Joseph and Dr. Bhanumurthy to give Professor Gulati Centenary lecture. I had the opportunity to be his student and student of Dr. T.M. Thomas Isaac for both my MPhil and PhD. And just now, Dr. Jose mentioned about, how careful Dr. Gulati was about writing. And one day, I think he was slightly irritated with the way the draft I wrote. And he told me, smilingly, he said that when somebody reads it, you will not be there to explain. So I understood that. I said, I'll come back. So I wrote a better draft and went back next day morning. I was happy. So he was very particular about the way you write. I think that is something which is which actually I learned every time more than the economics. Whatever little you write, even one paragraph, you would read, correct, and then you would make comments on that paragraph. And that was a great part of learning as a student, both as MPhil and PhD students. Dr. A.V. Jose, Dr. Govind Rao, Dr. Hasib Drabu, and distinguished participants of the dais. Today, I will speak on economic uncertainties, a perspective on fiscal prudence, rules, and risk. I was thinking I thought that I would speak on center-state relations, but then that was something that Dr. Gulati has done extensive work, and then I saw the program, and there is a special session on issues before the Finance Commission, and there was a session on federalism. So I thought I would speak on economic uncertainties, a perspective on fiscal rules, risk, and prudence. So this is something which I have been working on, and my presentation here has these components. I'll talk about the key issues related to global economic uncertainties and India's macroeconomic challenges. Increasing debt, and it's not only public debt. We have been hearing a lot about public debt, but today I would like to draw your attention to the increase in global debt, which includes private debt as well as non-financial private corporate debt. And how that impacts fiscal and financial stability is something that I would like to speak about. I would talk about homogeneity, flexibility, and views on fiscal policy, and the new fiscal institutions that we created in uncertain times and how they have worked. And I'll make special reference to what kind of institutions you created during the global financial crisis to deal with fiscal uncertainties and how they worked in the last, say, 15, 20 years. And after the 2008 crisis, then I'll very briefly, on macroeconomic uncertainties and fiscal imbalance in India, the long-term trade, and draw a couple of inferences from there and try to relate to the fiscal rules. And then I'll conclude. Before I conclude, I would talk about structural issues in federal setting and what does that mean for fiscal rule. So there is this discussion about what are the distinguishing features of the macroeconomic uncertainty that we face now. And the last uncertainty before COVID that we had globally was the global financial crisis. And if we look at the uncertainty now, the increase in fiscal imbalance and government debt during the COVID-19 is much faster than the increase in debt and deficit during the global financial crisis. That's the first distinguishing feature. Since the current crisis is impacting the households, the nature of the stimulus provided now in character is very different than the nature of stimulus that was provided during the global financial crisis to the banks. So there is a characteristic difference between the nature of fiscal stimulus, and it has got implications with the way we are talking about transfer payments, giving it different names, etc. I'll come to that little later when we talk about India. Then now, if we look at government, and I'm talking about aggregate debt, not government debt, and if IMF estimates, if we take the latest available estimates, there is current crisis. During the current crisis, the banks supported, that means it's outside the government. So bank supported fiscal stimulus was 4,000 USD. So that's still not there as a part of the budget. So in other words, when it comes to the budget, to that extent, the budgetary deficit and debt would go up if there is a default. And why the chance of default is high, I talk about it. And what kind of fiscal policies then we need is something that I would like to conclude. The global economy is also dealing with an unprecedented increase in the level of inequality now. Now, we had a discussion about inequality earlier, which talked about inequality is increasing with a rising growth. Before global financial crisis, a lot of globalization, mean income rising, global income rising. We are talking about country formations, BRICS, IPSA, etc. And then we said there has been a rise in inequality. But now the rise in inequality that we see is happening because there is an uncertain economic environment, falling growth, decline in per capita income in real term, because there is inflation is very high. So the inequality that we talked today and inequality we talked before the global financial crisis is very different. This inequality can be quite challenging to deal with for the households because the income is also falling. So that is another aspect which is probably out of the discourse now when we talk about macroeconomic. There is asymmetry in the current macroeconomic scenario. If we look at the global discussion after Trump came in, there has been there has been tariff, counter tariff discussions. There has been discussions about the kind of globalization we are going to have. So those are different discussions. That was not there during the global financial crisis. In India, current macroeconomic challenges are characterized by decline in financial savings. I'll talk about it. Slowdown in growth and elevated level of general government debt, including government debt, general debt, including households, and the debt of the government. There is asymmetry in the fiscal management across levels of government, and this has become really more pronounced in this year's budget. I'll talk about it. And how that is going to impact redistribution and spending at the state level is something that I'll try to talk. And then I'll talk about fiscal rule and fiscal balance and the fiscal stability for redistributive expenditure. So that's the broad structure. Now, if we look at the global public debt, and global public, this is the IMF fiscal monitor data, 2024, the latest data available on global public debt. And if we look at global public debt, it's now around 237% of GDP. COVID time, it was around 260, 58%. It has come down. But look at the household debt. Household debt, which was in the 1950s, less than around 10% of GDP, is now 50. This is a global household debt, which is now 54% of GDP. And if we take it as a percentage of the total public debt, it's around 57%. Of course, household debt is not, but household debt has an implication for public debt, because I think there's a need for support to the households, because there is an extreme stress at the household level in terms of overall debt. So just looking at public debt, which is coming down, household debt is also not coming, is coming down. Private debt also has come down from its peak from the COVID. But if we look at the volume, I think household debt remains a significant issue. and that has implications in terms of macro management. Now, and now this debt is on domestic currency. Now, different countries have different exposures to international debt. Now, international debt statistics published by the IMF for the year 2022 shows that external debt stock is at an elevated level. And it is into 2020, it was 123% of the export earning of countries. So if we talk about our neighborhood, Sri Lanka had a major crisis. Pakistan has a major crisis. And these are all low-income developing countries who depend either on aid or a lot of foreign exchange earning. And since they have large exposure to the external debt, I think these countries are having serious macroeconomic crisis. One of the reasons why India is different is India's debt composition is very different because our exposure to external debt is very small as far as the government is concerned. So government doesn't have major the government deficit is entirely financed by domestic, so almost entirely financed by domestic sources. So in that context, we don't have this external sector risk, but certainly when we see countries after country collapsing because of the external debt exposure, it's because they are stronger dollar, so their exposure to the external debt and debt servicing obligation is going up. Export earnings are not increasing. In the process, they are having serious macroeconomic crisis. So in that context, if we look at India's total liability to debt to GDP ratio of the union and states from 2001 to 2022-23, yes, we had a big COVID peak, but it has started coming down, both for the union and the states, and largely internal. So that is one strength that is important to note for India. Now let's look at the household debt. This is household debt of all the G20 countries. And if we look at India's household debt, if we look at before the financial crisis, that is 2004 to 2007, if we take the average, the household debt of India was around 8-9% of GDP. Today, India's household debt is 40% of GDP. It has come down slightly. It is around 37% of GDP. This is taken from the global database that the IMF provides. So India's households are exposed to more and more debt, and this has happened within a short span of 15-20 years. So 2008 to 2025 today, this is up to 2024. So it has happened within a short span of 15 years that household debt has increased from as low as 8% of GDP to now at around 37-38% of GDP. Now, apart from this, there is this issue of financialization and digitization, which made your savings account and the credit card as your cash in your pocket because of digitization. I think that liability is only going to go up. So in that context, this exposure of the households to a large extent of to a large level of household is a concern. Now, saying that India's household debt is much lower than Australia, Canada, United Kingdom, and United States really does not make much sense because our household's ability to finance that debt is much lower because our per capita income is much lower than these countries. So in that context, the instability that households are exposed to now because of the increase in debt is a real concern. And in that context, we really need to look at how this has impacted our key macro variables like savings and investment. So let me get to the savings now. Now, if we look at savings, India's household financial sector savings and liability, the gross financial saving is that reddish kind of a bar. So that is at the top. Our financial savings have sharply plummeted from a peak of 15.5% to 11.5%. But more than that, what is most important to see in the year 22-23, if we look at the financial liabilities are more than the net financial savings. So this decline in saving, anything that happens in India now, decline in growth is called, it's a blip. Decline in savings is called a blip. But these are not incidents that are happening once in a while. I think there are structural weakness that are very evident from key macro data. So there is an increase in household debt. there is an increase in households liabilities, and net financial saving has actually declined. Now let us, so that's the major macro risk that the household and the economy faces, because savings is declining. And if we relate it to the debt, because the debt is financed by savings of the domestic, of the household sector, and that is coming down, how are you going to finance our debt in the next 20 years, or in the medium term, say for the next 10 years, is going to be an issue. So we need to really be worried about why the savings is declining and what is the corrective measure that we can take to increase household savings. Of course, cannot be an administrative measure, but there's something beyond that that has to be done. Now look at this selected. Yes, yes. Oh, sorry. Oh, I don't know. How do I? Is this? No. No. Yeah, I'm trying to go back. No, but it's going on. How to? Huh? Which one? Is this one? No, no.
Now, 21, 22, you're at 3.8.
Yes.
And you go to 5.3 in terms of financial liability.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
In 1 year, it's a 30 basis point.
Yeah, that's the national account statistics.
But something really suddenly.
Yes. I don't know.
Very stable. If you see, you're seeing a
No, the financial saving has been declining. It's not stable.
Liability.
Yeah.
3.8 is over a span of 10 years.
Yeah.
And then 1 year it becomes.
That's correct. But
Point is, no, I don't understand what you think. Some reason for it.
so okay. So now if we look at this, we know, but the point is, this is again from the national account statistics. So national, if we look at the financial saving is declining, and the kind of exposures that the households have in terms of shares, debentures, and within shares and debentures, mutual fund has increased from 2000. It is not because it's very recent, it has started earlier, but now if we look at their exposure to shares and debentures, within shares and debentures mutual fund, it has really increased. And of course, gold and silver are not part of the physical savings, but it's almost like cash in hand. So if you look at gold and silver, its share also is coming down. So there has been a lot of this savings happening in terms of, sorry, not this saving. There is a lot of compositional shift happening in terms of savings, and which is going to more unsafe, more risky assets. So this is something happening. So there are three risks. One is household debt has increased. Household savings, financial saving is declining. Composition of saving is shifting towards more risky assets. So these are the things that are very evident from the basic data that we see in terms of our overall macro management and finances. Now, if we look at the number of new SIPs registered in this country, a number of SIPs discontinued, tenure completed last 4 months. So there has been a number of SIPs discontinued in February 2025 is more than the number of SIPs registered. So this is happening now because the stocks market is falling. There has been a decline in growth, and in that context, we see so a lot of money has been lost because people have discontinued or exited from the SIPs. So if we take all this together, I think the household sector stress is very evident, and household sectors are also willing to play it very risky in terms of exposing themselves to financial to riskier assets. So that's one part of the story. Now if we now look at, now in this context, I'll talk about this discussion about subsidies, individual transfers to households. So when I was preparing for this lecture, I didn't know about this data set. World Bank has brought out a very important data set. It says prosperity data 360. And this prosperity data 360 actually gives you social benefit transfers as a percentage of GDP. Now, this social benefit transfer as a percentage of GDP doesn't have India data, but they have data for major countries. So this I have taken for the G20 countries. And if we look at the social benefit transfers, which actually increased, there was a spike because of COVID, they have been coming down across countries. So that means government support in terms of volume as a percentage of GDP has been coming down. Social benefit transfer. This is general government. So all governments taken together. Since India data is not there, and I didn't have the time, it's a major exercise to calculate what is the social benefit transfer in India. Definitionally, it is all the cash transfers and all the transfers in kind. So in value terms. These transfers have come down after COVID very significantly. And since I did not have the India data, what I tried to do here, I actually looked at general government primary expenditure, net of capex, because capital expenditure is not a social transfer, and net of pension liabilities, which is again a government liability based on a contractual agreement with the employees. So if we look at in India also, the general government expenditure, primary expenditure, net of capex and pension, somewhere the social transfer also will be hidden there. So that has sharply declined from 20% of GDP in 2021 to 15.4% of GDP. So the point here is, so when we really talk about that we are giving a lot of subsidies, a lot of transfers, a lot of freebies, I think data just doesn't support that. So in that context, I think when we talk about all the money is being drained out, but because subsidies are given, cash transfers are given, I'm not talking about design of cash transfers. And if we look at data, take out interest payment, take out pension, take out other liabilities, capex, etc., it has actually fallen. It has fallen by 5 percentage point of GDP in the last 3-4 years, which is a very, very significant amount. So now let me come to, so this is the context, this is the data. So in that context, what are the things that we have done since global financial crisis till now? I think two issues that I'll talk about. One is homogeneity in flexibility in fiscal rules. And what is good in terms of macro discussion now compared to global financial crisis is, I think in many countries, there is a discussion about global rethinking about fiscal rules. I think there's a recognition now. There's a lot of paper run by IMF, World Bank themselves, and they say that they also say that there is a need to rethink about fiscal rules. That's the second, the first important difference if we compare what was the thinking globally after the global financial crisis and what is the thinking now. There's a lot of literature on this, and this establishes the fact that there is a need to rethink about fiscal rules because you need to give greater flexibility to the government. Second, about institution. There was, after the global financial crisis, there were fiscal institutions created, the independent fiscal councils, and how they work. We had done some work on that. I'll speak briefly on that, and then on the homogeneity of fiscal rules. Now, if we talk about flexible fiscal framework, there is this issue of higher fiscal space to be given so that you create, but you don't violate long-run debt sustainability. Now, a transparent fiscal framework to deal with off-budget borrowing and liabilities. If we look at international literature on this, the harmonized framework of guarantee management law will be critical for greater fiscal transparency. Country-wise experience shows that fiscal management at the multi-level fiscal system has additional complexities, which also these new rules, new discussions actually talk about that. Now I'll talk about the debt rule. Debt rule is an option, and India has adopted the debt rule because the 25-26 budget says that we are going to have a debt rule which will make debt to GDP, which will help us reach debt to GDP ratio at 50% of GDP by 2030-31. But that's for the union government. That has implications for states, and I'll come to that. Now there was this fiscal council created earlier. Now IMF has a fascinating data set which says the fiscal council data set, and there are 51 countries which have fiscal institutions. Now 51 countries which have fiscal institutions called independent fiscal council. More than 30 countries had IMF loan. So it was part of the IMF conditionality. So these fiscal councils were created as an additional layer of bureaucratic intervention to make fiscal policy transparent. And if we look at these countries, in most of the countries, their role is very different. And some of them actually do a forecast assessment, some of them long-term sustainability, some of them costing measures. So there is no uniformity in role. And secondly, it's an additional layer of complexity. And third is the issue of somebody who is not politically empowered through a process of election has been asked to evaluate government policies. How that works, really do not know. So I looked at the IMF data gives staffing pattern, and in some countries, fiscal council is managed by 3 people, and in some countries, fiscal council is managed by 200 people. So one good thing about fiscal council now after the COVID-19 pandemic, it is nobody is talking about having a strengthening fiscal council. Everybody is talking about improving the fiscal rule so that it gives greater flexibility. I think that's a new development, and that's an improvement compared to the way we manage fiscal rule. So globally, now, what is the macroeconomic? How much time do I have?
I'm sure that this session. But I think
10 minutes. Okay. So now if we look at macroeconomic uncertainties and fiscal imbalance in India, and this is some work that I have done earlier. I thought I thought I'll just put this to actually draw a couple of issues here. I think if we look at all the major crises that India had, Asian influenza, China war, Pak war, smallpox, economic crisis, Asian financial crisis, global financial crisis, COVID-19, Russia-Ukraine war, and you look at the total expenditure, revenue received in these phases, and you will always see that after the increase in debt, increase in expenditure, there is a sharp correction that is happening even now. So if you look at data up to 2024-25 BB. So in the context of overall fiscal management, I don't think we really have expanded in terms of our expenditure to GDP ratio. We have actually contracted very significantly after COVID. And this is the trend that we have observed in the past as well. Now, if we look at the central government deficit liabilities as a percentage of GDP, you will see this long time series data show that there has been a significant correction in the debt, fiscal deficit, revenue deficit, and total liabilities. Total liabilities is now for the central government is around 50%, 55% of GDP. So total liabilities is 55, which was around 67. So if we add state debt also has corrected. So total debt is around 82% of GDP if we take states and center together. So in a sense, the kind of correction we have seen in the last 3-4 years after COVID, with a significant contraction in the primary revenue expenditure space, the kind of discussion we are having in terms of government is making a lot of profligate spending and giving a lot of transfers to household. I think even if the government composition has changed, I think given that household debt has gone up, I think that's that's a natural course of action for any government to do. So to say that this is actually going to wreck public finances and going to create a major problem, I think that's not borne by the data. So that's the first point that I wanted to make. Second point that I wanted to make is interest payment is again going up. So we have a problem of debt because which is reducing the primary expenditure space. So there is a need to manage non-interest expenditure because primary expenditure is going up. So in that context, I think what is important is to reduce the debt ratio. But if we and from that point of view, targeting debt is better rather than the fiscal deficit, because fiscal deficit brings a lot of rigidity on a yearly basis for the government to do expenditure which is required. And I think it is required. Redistribution is a very important component of government expenditure given the high exposure of households to debt. Now couple of one important issue that I wanted to also highlight, that some increase in savings has happened in the last couple of investment has happened in the last 2-3 years. But decline liability, much of it could be also externally debt financed. So we really have to see how this investment is going to play out in terms of growth, because we have seen also decline in growth in the last couple of quarters. So to conclude, there is a need to start fiscal normalization without creating adverse distributional consequences. So that is very important. The future macroeconomic risk will rise from household sector-led financial instabilities. And this has happened during global financial crisis. And if this and this requires a rethink about the tunnel vision of risk. We are already talking about, this 3% zero revenue deficit, and then capex. And most of the capex are happening outside for the center as well as in many states. So in that context, I think we need to have an understanding of whether we should target deficit or we should target debt. Central government has already moved to debt, so there is no deficit target. There is some work that has been done, which shows that it actually brings down the fiscal deficit by 2030, 31 to 3% of GDP, 3.5% of GDP for the central government. Now, this period is very important, 25, 26 to 2030, 31, because of the debt buildup at the household level. So in that case, if we take this development in the central government where debt target has been reworked and to be achieved by 2030, 31 at 50% of GDP, what does that mean for the states? Because for the states, if a debt target is given, then they have a greater flexibility in terms of deficit. So in other words, we need to talk about a new normal debt ratio and move from a deficit target to a debt target. And as a concluding remark, I would also say that IMF also has a fiscal rules data set. And this fiscal rule data set, if we look at all the emerging countries, except India and one or two other countries, fiscal rule is applicable only to the central government, because central government has a macroeconomic stability function. Since our constitution actually imposes a hard budget constraint on the states, I think a debt ratio, which the general government debt ratio as center is 50, and if we say that states will have to rework a debt ratio which is sustainable in terms of a medium term up to 2030, what that debt ratio should be the only target, and allow the flexibility in the fiscal deficit to continue, ensuring that debt to GDP ratio goes down over time, and interest payment ratio to GDP ratio also goes down, because the debt ratio is supposed will come if there's a target, the debt ratio has to come down in a time-bound manner, which would then create fiscal space for other development spending. So fiscal expansion needs to take into consideration the shrinking primary revenue expenditure space due to rising fiscal interest payments. So the fiscal rules moving from deficit to debt is an important thing. And in a multi-level fiscal system, where we are talking about central government's amendment says that we'll try to achieve 60% debt GDP ratio at the general government level by 20 to 23. Now, center is going to have it by 50 by 2030, 31 at 50%. I think what would the general government debt and what would the individual debt ratio of the states? That would be more important rather than just targeting the fiscal deficit. Thank you.
Yes, sir. I will take two questions. We have few minutes left to raise questions. Yeah. Sushi. No.
This would mean if this is a target, they are deflating the economy. And that's why private investment is shy. That's why they don't demand. I mean, trying to cut this deficit at this time, when the economy needs a stimulus, because you have sharply brought it down, would mean you're deflating the economy. The kind of thing they did in 2017, 18, when prices were stagnant for 2 or 3 years.
Shall I answer? Okay. No, I was just trying to say that I think there is a recognition of the fact that reducing fiscal deficit on a year-on-year basis is very difficult, and that's why center has moved from deficit target to a debt target, because center hasn't achieved. So that way it gives a space for the next 5 years to have a higher deficit Of course, center hasn't achieved 3% target anyway, but it also gives additional flexibility in terms of achieving a debt target by 2030, 50. But this, since most of the redistributive spending, my point was most of the redistributive spendings are at the state level, similar flexibility should be provided at the state level too. So, and at the general government level, what that debt ratio should also be worked out, and that target be given rather than giving a debt deficit target on a year-on-year basis.
Thank you, sir. Two-part question. First, following up on what was just asked, given the consolidation that we have seen post-COVID in terms of the fiscal deficit, uh, is it is it a reasonable thing to say that India is pursuing some sort of austerity-based policy right now, moving in that direction at least? And the second part regarding the debt targeting, right? We've seen across countries in the world where, especially in the case of US, where a debt ceiling has always been a problem, right? There have been government shutdowns, there have been bipartisan fights regarding how much should be the debt ceiling or how that has adversely impacted the US economy in that sense. So, related to that, shouldn't a realistic target be based on inflation? Because when we talk about government expenditure, the only real resource constraint should be on how much real resources are there in the economy and whether or not our expenditure is pushing up prices to the extent that the economy cannot sustain it. So why do we talk about monetary policy and fiscal policy in such an exclusive manner where inflation and debt are not really linked together to any extent? Because in my opinion, that would probably be a better approach of looking at things overall when we take a macroeconomic perspective. Thank you.
Shall I? Yeah, thank you. Very good questions. On the question of, austerity, my understanding is that when we have a debt ratio which is 80% and centers interest payment to revenue receipt ratio is more than 30% of revenue, we really cannot say that debt doesn't matter. And even if you look at debt sustainability condition of DOMA is not saying that any level of debt is sustainable. He is telling debt is sustainable under certain condition. So we have to talk about that sustainable level of deficit, debt. So deficit debt. Our FRBM target earlier said we target deficit. There was some target for debt also. But now Government of India says that we'll achieve a debt target of 50% of GDP by 2030-31. So they want flexibility. But I am saying that flexibility has to be at the general government debt level, no? So if that flexibility is at the general government debt level, then what should that be? So I think we need to have a balance between austerity and how much we can spend. So there's nothing wrong with austerity, but what level of austerity is very important to understand. So I'm not saying that we shut down government, but certainly sustainable debt is equally important. So on the question of inflation, yes, inflation can knock off your debt. So if you have high inflation, your debt to GDP ratio can come down. So stability of inflation is very important. So if we look at last couple of years, you will see that our nominal GDP growth rate assumed in the budget was around 10% of 10% annual growth. And but Government of India's but if you look at nominal GDP growth rate, because of high inflation, I think it has grown at the rate of more than 11-12%. So that way there was a correction. But since budget is also in cash term, I don't see it as a major problem unless inflation is very high. So if there is a stable inflation, I think that issue is not a very big concern in terms of management. So inflation, we are not talking fiscal policy in isolation. Certainly inflation is very important. I'm not saying that we inflate and then we have high inflation and we knock off debt. That's not what I'm saying. We just stable I'm assuming that inflation will not rise. So with a stable 4-5% inflation, what kind of debt ratios correction we want to see? That's the limited point I was trying to make. Yes, sir.
Compliments to you for doing this hard research. I have just a couple of minor questions to ask. One is, in a stable economic environment that we talk about, where inflation is not very high, if you only focus on debt, what happens to the quality of public expenditure? Okay, now ultimately, it's important that, sort of quality of public expenditure also has to be seen. In other words, do we really start with one single target, or do you want multiple targets? This is one of the important questions, because to me, quality of public expenditure is also equally important, because sort of you can't just borrow and then spend money on things which do not yield the return. That's one. More important than that, when you come to the subnational level, the issue for the subnational governments, since macroeconomic stabilization is predominantly a central function, it's the interest payments. Even when you say that, oh, I'll only focus on the debt, there is always a hanging problem of interest payments. And that's one of the things. And from there to, on your redistributive things, I would only say the thing. I think every elected government you know, has a mandate to do whatever redistribution it wants to do. And redistribution is not done by the market. Obviously, redistribution is a government function. I mean, it is here that you need to see whether giving conditional transfers are better than subsidizing commodity. I mean, that's a minor issue. But the question that every elected government has to ask is, what is the opportunity cost that you have to bear? Now, I mean, whether you want to do immediate things, or that. I mean, the decision is theirs. After all, they are the elected people. But as economists, we are not, we are supposed to think about the opportunity cost of whatever, however much you want to do the redistribution. There must be some trade-off somewhere. But finally, I want to say about, I mean, this is something which I've also said here. All the time, this is a narrative saying that when during the global financial crisis, that things went. It was not global financial crisis. It was the election in 2008-9. In the election, there were three promises made: farm loan waiver, pay commission recommendation application, and expansion of national rural employment guarantee. I don't want to question the merits of these. But the fact of the matter is that these were not internalized into the budget. And in the budget estimate, if you see for 2008-9, it says your fiscal deficit will be 2.5%. Now, global financial crisis came much later. And when it came, that was after September. And at that time, of course, oil prices rised. Finally, when you see the oil pool sort of deficit and the fiscal deficit, that year, instead of sort of budgeted fiscal deficit was 2.5% at the center, the total was 7.5%. And since then, we have never come back. And we even forgot to sort of pursue our fiscal targets altogether, because we thought we can't do it. And union government cannot do it. They were doing it until they were trying to reach 2007-8, they have reached the 3%. That's the only year they have reached the 3%. I just thought, we don't put the blame on global financial crisis for the crime that we commit.
Yes.
So the debt target you have mentioned, it should be based on the sustainability framework, right? So sustainability based debt target you are mentioning. And my question is, so suppose
No, I haven't talked about the design of debt target. I just said that debt target will be better than a target that focuses on deficit.
If you want to target for the debt target, I mean, anyway, the sustainability frameworks are there. We cannot, many papers are suggesting we cannot go for the basic dormer condition. We have advanced frameworks, sustainability framework for fixing the debt targets and all. So if so, we cannot keep the uniform target for the consolidated level because we have state-specific considerations. So in the advanced model says that there are other considerations also taken into consideration when you have a debt target.
What is the question?
So it should be whether it should be flexible. I mean, there should be a flexible debt target for the state instead of having a uniform combined debt level. That it is actually in the context of regional imbalances, we need to consider that also. That is my question.
Thank you. Thank you, sir, for your questions. On the quality of public expenditure, yes, I have not looked at it. But quality of public expenditure, the way we judge in terms of revenue deficit reduction, I think if we look at the central budget, the center's capital expenditure has only two components. One is railways, other is defense. So there is nothing called capital expenditure at the central level. So the center's capital revenue deficit that is arising is because of the centrally sponsored scheme, because those are booked as grants. Now the increase in capital expenditure we see is interest-free loans to the states. That's a very innovative way of giving grants to the states. So in that context, I think capital expenditure, as we see at the state level, again, it is no longer a target which is linked to your borrowing, because that was there earlier when the states and the states have got into a revenue deficit, but still that is not a very significant amount. So quality of expenditure certainly remains an issue, but if we look at overall debt target, within that, how that redistribution, I think it should be left to the government to decide. So I thought the debt target would be good with a stable inflation, rather than targeting three things: debt, revenue deficit, and fiscal deficit, given there is uncertainty and given there is a stress at the household level. So that's and as a medium-term strategy that can work, but we can certainly debate. On the question of, yes, interest movement to revenue receipt ratio, I completely agree. Interest movement to revenue receipt ratio, taking center and states together, is very high. So there is a need to reduce it. I was coming from that point only. So that primary revenue expenditure space should increase. So that way there is a need for a reduction in debt ratio. Opportunity cost of fund, yes, opportunity cost of fund is an issue, but I was trying to make an argument that whether what we are doing today is doing because we are doing it today because there is a crisis at the household level, because there is an increase in household liability. The kind of transfers that we are giving, whatever color we give, there is no other option. We have to do this. That's something which has to be done. That's the point I was trying to make. Opportunity cost of fund is something that needs to be worked out. I haven't done that exercise. Uniform deficit target or a flexible debt target. Yes, these are important questions, but I really do not know what would be the state specific debt target. But given that there is a general government debt, Government of India already amended the FRBM Act, which says 60. Now Government of India has a 50% debt target. So is the state debt target clean? Certainly not. So we need to have that discussion. So if we are moving to, and if we continue to have 3% target for the states, what will be the general government debt to GDP ratio? I am interested as a macro economic exercise, the general government debt target. I am not interested what center would do, what individual states would do. So if there is a general government debt target, that can be worked out. But I do not know. That requires more exercise. So that's but it's an important question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Chakravarti, for a wonderful presentation. The last time, I mean, when I was here, I think the major discussions really were about how household savings was so high, and it was a problem. In fact, K.N. Raj worked on that whole issue of high household savings, low investments, and the challenge of macroeconomic growth was how do you convert household savings into investments? And today, for the first time, at least I have never noticed this figure, that we are at a stage 30 years later when households is now in a deficit, because the household savings was generating growth, government was dissaving, so was the private corporate sector. And now you have exactly the opposite situation where households actually have a net dissaving with liabilities going up. And that, for me, is a major macroeconomic point of inflection, which would require serious attention. But I'd also urge that let's look beyond governments, because, you know, the entire thing of whether it's debt or others is really linked to government. Today, the government spending is a fraction of the private sector spending. And we're not looking at what is happening there and how corporates today are far more leveraged than the government, with far less instruments of control. So the real crisis would not, in my opinion, a macroeconomic crisis. You may have a fiscal crisis, you may have a liquidity crisis, you may have a solvency crisis, but you're not going to have a full macroeconomic crisis emerging from government. Your major points of vulnerability today are the private corporate sector, which is so heavily leveraged, not just internally, with which a whole new set of institutions has come in as private equity, venture capitalists, or whatever, plus their tremendous exposure to the Indian banking space, which we have now seen a bit of cleanup in terms of NPAs. So really, I think one of the lessons from this is to also expand the zone to look at the flashpoints of finance outside of government transfers, which will give it a much larger ambit. But thank you very much. It's been really enlightening to hear this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a break now? Yes. I think next session. Please. We have 10 minutes.
This distinguished lecture, I take this opportunity to extend a heartfelt gratitude. A sincere thank you to Professor Pinaki Chakravarti for delivering such a thought-provoking lecture. A deepest appreciation to Professor T.M. Thomas Isaac and Dr. Hasib Drabu for guiding today's session with their insights and expertise. A special thanks to Dr. A.V. Jose for commemorating Professor I.S. Gulati's remarkable legacy. And of course, a warm thank you to all our esteemed guests, scholars, and audience members for being a part of this lecture. With that, we formally conclude the Professor I.S. Gulati Centenary Lecture. Thank you all. The fourth plenary session will commence shortly in the same auditorium. Thank you once again.
Mr. Gulati.